We are now going to talk about what to do immediately before the session. You have already completed CSP, the Consciousness Settling Procedure, and now you are sitting at the desk and in the chair in which you are going to do the remote viewing session. And the remote viewing session begins with the viewer sitting at a clean desk. Ideally, the only items that should be on the desk are a pen and a thin stack of white paper. It is best to use a ballpoint pen that has liquid black ink. The pen's point can be anywhere from 0.2 millimeters to 0.4 millimeters. I personally enjoy using a 0.2 or 0.3 millimeter pen. A good quality pen that does not produce much friction when writing is truly ideal. Traditional ballpoint pens that use gummy ink require too much downward pressure when writing to be optimal. Sometimes a session can go on for quite a while, and if you're pressing too hard, then your focus of attention can shift to your tiring fingers rather than to the remote viewing target. The ideal training room should be neutral in color. Many people have learned how to remote view in all sorts of environments, but if you have a choice, it would be best to have your training room to have a neutral color such as a gray, a powder blue, perhaps a light brown. It is probably not a good idea to use, say, a child's playroom that has lots of primary colors on the walls with pictures and everything. The idea is to minimize the strong stimuli that come in through the senses, such as bright visual colors. But if the only room that is available to you happens to have bright colors and pictures on the wall, don't worry much about it. Again, many people have learned how to remote view in all sorts of environments. That I describe the ideal setting doesn't mean that you cannot proceed with your training just because something may not be quite right, such as the colors on the wall. Just don't worry about it. But if you have a choice of which room to remote view in, if there's a room with generally neutral colors, try to pick that room if it's possible. Now, before remote viewing, you should be well rested. I cannot emphasize this enough. If you're very tired, this tiredness dulls the conscious mind, and a tired conscious mind has a significant amount of difficulty perceiving information from the subspace mind. A good night's sleep is ideal for a morning remote viewing session, for example. And if you're going to remote view in the afternoon, you might take a 15-minute nap somewhere around midday before doing your session in order to rest. And then always remember to do CSP, the Consciousness Settling Procedure, immediately prior to beginning the remote viewing session. You should also be comfortably fed before beginning your remote viewing session. This means that you should not be hungry, but you should also not be overfed. Hunger and feeling stuffed produce physical stimuli that are sometimes difficult for the conscious mind to ignore. Remember that the subspace mind yields a relatively weak informational signal to the conscious mind, and we want to try to minimize any physiological stimulus that could swamp the subspace signal. So, eat comfortably, not too much, but not too little, just so that you're not feeling stuffed, but also not feeling hunger either. It is essential that you remote view in a quiet environment. If it is possible, try to close all the windows and doors of the remote viewing room. Also, if it is possible in your situation, try to turn off the ringer of the phone so that you cannot be disturbed during the remote viewing session. Turn off any radios or televisions that may be audible nearby. Try to avoid wearing any perfume, cologne, aftershave, or other strong scents. This is important when training in a group environment particularly. If you smoke, it would be best if you wore freshly washed clothes during the session. that do not smell of smoke. This is particularly true if you're training in a group environment. People who use recreational drugs or any other drugs with psychoactive qualities probably should not try to remote view at all. These drugs tend to release any controls that the conscious mind has over the imagination. And that is exactly opposite that which we are trying to do when we are remote viewing. With respect to drugs of any type, one should try to be as drug-free as possible. However, anyone using drugs that are prescribed by their doctor should always check with their doctor before discontinuing any such treatment. Learning how to remote view is not as important as maintaining one's health and mental balance. Before beginning your session, you should sit comfortably on a chair at your desk with both feet on the floor. The legs should not be crossed. You should sit up straight, not off to one side, or not sitting on one foot like in a lotus position. The hands should be relaxed, with the pen held over a single clean sheet of paper. And the paper is positioned in what we call portrait mode, which is vertically. The stack of extra paper should be off to the right-hand side of the desk. Now we want to begin with the SRV affirmation. The SRV affirmation is normally read aloud with a soft voice, even in solo sessions. The affirmation produces a subtle shift in the sensibilities of the mind that helps to connect the awareness of the conscious mind to the perceptive capabilities of the subspace mind. The SRV affirmation is designed to closely approximate the way sequential and connected thoughts are felt telepathically, piece by piece, one thought ball at a time. Viewers should read the affirmation slowly, pausing briefly after each comma or period. Let me read to you the affirmation. Just listen to it now. Listen to how I read it. You may follow along with your printed copy. I am a spiritual being. Because I am a spiritual being, I am able to perceive beyond all boundaries of time and space. My consciousness is ever present with all that is, with all that ever was, and with all that ever will be. It is in my nature as a human to be able to perceive and thus to know all that there is to know. Everywhere, at all times, I seek to learn and thus to evolve, to further my own personal growth and to assist others in their growth. I direct my attention to a chosen point of existence. I observe what is there. I study it carefully. I record what I find. After you have completed the SRV affirmation, take the paper on which it is written and put it off to the side. Next, we take the clean, fresh piece of paper that's in front of us, and we write the SRV identifying header on top of the first piece of paper. This header contains information about who we are, the time and date that we are conducting the remote viewing session, the type of data that are being collected, as well as physical and emotional distractions that we may have at the time, and also any advanced perceptuals or any thoughts we may have about what the target might be. More formally, viewers declare the condition of their physical state. We call this PS. Their emotional state, we call this ES. And any advanced perceptuals, which we call AP. We do this centered at the top of the first page. Declaring your physical and emotional states allows you to release any psychological pressure that could be in the mind due to wanting to shift your attention to those areas. The declarations can be positive, they can be neutral, or they can be negative. It doesn't matter. Positive types of declarations could include things like, I feel happy, or I feel upbeat. A negative declaration could be something like, I have a sore foot, a sore back, or I didn't like lunch, or something like that. Unusually strong physical state or emotional state declarations, such as perhaps having a fight with a spouse or something bad like that, may suggest that the session might be postponed until later, after those feelings have a chance to calm down. Also, if you are in significant pain due to, say, severe arthritis, it might be better to delay the session until the pain abates. In some ways, it is useful to compare the conscious mind to the mentality of a small child. When the conscious mind is experiencing something, it likes to be heard. Declaring the physical state and the emotional state satisfies this need in the conscious mind. It helps the conscious mind relax, and it circumvents its natural desire to force the issue of having its needs recognized later in the session, which could potentially corrupt the integrity of the data. Often a viewer begins a session thinking that he or she has an idea as to what the target is. Those ideas are called advanced perceptuals, and they may or may not be correct. Usually, they are not correct. Although it is true that sometimes the accuracy of an advanced perceptual can be quite surprisingly correct. Regardless of the accuracy or inaccuracy of any advanced perceptual, all advanced perceptuals need to be declared at the outset of the session, or they will build in pressure in the conscious mind of the viewer during the session and are likely to emerge in some form during the actual flow of the data. Declaring these advanced perceptuals in advance, again, relaxes the conscious mind by satisfying its desire to be heard, and it thereby minimizes the risk of contaminating the data later on. Let us fill out a complete header right now. On the right-hand side of the top of the paper, write your name. Right under that, write the date, today's date. And right under that, write the time right now when you're listening to this lesson. On the far left of the paper, again at the top, write down the words type 4 using the numeral 4. Now, in the middle at the top of the paper, write PS dash and then write your physical state. You may write something like I feel fine or okay or whatever your physical state may be. Immediately under that, write ES dash and then declare your emotional state. How do you feel? You can write okay, fine, very settled, or whatever your emotional state may be. And right under that, declare your advanced perceptuals by writing AP dash. None is the most common advanced perceptual, but whatever you may have, you may write down. Whatever thoughts you may have about the target, briefly in a word or two or a phrase, just write that down. You're encouraged not to think about this initial header as a frivolous formality. It is much more than that. Everything is very carefully structured in scientific remote viewing. Following these details from the outset of the session focuses the attention of the conscious mind on the structure of the page. You should be sure to follow all of the sometimes seemingly petty structural details of these protocols, including all of the formatting issues involving indentations, dashes, colons, whatever. Once the remote viewing session is proceeding at a fast pace, the conscious mind can do little else but keep track of all of these structural details. This frees the information conduit of the subspace mind from the controlling influence of the conscious mind. Figuratively, you're tying the hands of the conscious mind with activity, allowing the subspace mind to slip the data past the conscious mind with minimal interference. Now we are ready for the first step in our remote viewing process. Phase 1. After saying the SRV affirmation, the viewer receives the target coordinates from the monitor. That means that the monitor speaks the numbers out loud, being sure to speak deliberately and clearly so that all of the numbers can be heard. The target coordinates are two 4-digit random numbers, and the monitor places a slight pause between the two groups of 4-digit numbers. On the left-hand side of the page, the viewer writes the first 4-digit number, and then the second 4-digit number is written directly under the first. After writing the target coordinates, the viewer immediately places the point of the pen on the paper to the right of the target coordinates. At this point, what we call an ideogram is drawn. Now, an ideogram is a spontaneous drawing that takes only a moment to complete. The pen does not leave the surface of the paper until the ideogram is completed. It's just a quick mark. Ideograms normally are simple, but complex ideograms can occur. In general, each ideogram should represent one and only one aspect, or what we call gestalt, that's related to the target. For example, if the target is near a body of water, an ideogram could represent water. If there is an artificial structure at the target site, another ideogram could represent this structure, and so on. Only one ideogram is written for each recitation of the target coordinates. In phase 1, the monitor usually recites the target coordinate numbers 3 to 5 times, enabling the viewer to draw and decode a few ideograms, thereby obtaining information relating to different target gestalts. Each time the viewer writes down the target coordinates, it is said that he or she is taking or receiving these coordinates. After drawing the first ideogram, the viewer then writes the capital letter A, followed by a colon to the right of the ideogram. The viewer then describes the movement of the pen that occurred while writing the ideogram, and you write all of this down after the A colon. The description must describe the process of the pen's movement without the use of any labels. Now, here are some words that are generally acceptable in this regard. Vertical upward, vertical downward, diagonal upward, diagonal downward, sloping upward, sloping downward, curving upward, curving downward, moving upward, moving downward, moving across, slanting upward, slanting downward, curving over, curving under, horizontal flat across, horizontal flat along, angle. In general, words ending with ing or WARD, ing or ward sounds are generally preferred. Labels such as circle, a loop, or a square are to be avoided. Labeling adds conceptual meaning to data in remote viewing, and that is conscious mind analysis. Remote viewing is built upon perceptions that begin at the lowest level of conceptual abstraction and gradually move to higher levels of abstraction. In the beginning of phase 1, the lowest level of conceptual analysis is required. Next, we begin to probe the ideogram, and this is a delicate matter. The viewer places the point of the pen on the ideogram itself, the actual mark, and gently but firmly pushes the pen downward slightly into the table. The beginning viewer can probe one or more times, but should avoid more than 4 attempts. Each probe lasts between 1 and 2 seconds and absolutely no more than 3 seconds. While the pen is in contact with the line of the ideogram, the viewer normally perceives some feeling about the target. Now, too brief a contact with the ideogram does not allow the nervous system of the viewer to register the impression sufficiently to allow for an accurate decoding of the feeling. Too long a contact with the ideogram allows the conscious mind to intervene in the process and to distort or even fabricate the data. So one touches the point of the pen to the ideogram about a second or two. After the probe, the pen is removed from the ideogram and the viewer searches for a word to describe the sensation that was perceived during the probe. The first time that the viewer probes the ideogram, the attempt is made to discern what is called a primitive descriptor, of which there are 6 possible choices with one exception. These choices of primitive descriptors are hard, soft, semi-hard, semi-soft, wet, or mushy. While probing the ideogram, the viewer will actually sense the pen moving into the paper and table if the target is soft, wet, or mushy. Now, this may seem logically impossible due to the firmness of the writing surface. It nonetheless is consistently perceived by viewers. When gently pushing the pen into the paper, it will also feel wet if the target has water. The viewer must choose only one of the 6 possible descriptive options given above. No substitutions should be made, since this would invite the conscious mind to enter the process more fully. The choice of primitive descriptors is then written down under the written description of the movement of the pen. The one exception to picking one of the 6 primitive descriptors is if the viewer perceives movement or energetics in the ideogram. If this occurs, the viewer may or may not also perceive one of the 6 primitive descriptors. If the viewer does perceive one of the 6 primitive descriptors, then the chosen descriptor is declared and the viewer proceeds with the next step. However, if you perceive only movement or energetics, abandon the attempt to perceive a primitive descriptor and move directly to declaring an advanced descriptor. After you obtain a primitive descriptor, the viewer probes the ideogram again to obtain what is called an advanced descriptor. There are 5 choices, and the viewer must use only one of these choices. Here they are: natural, man-made, artificial, movement, energetics. After probing the ideogram, the viewer writes the advanced descriptor under the primitive descriptor. Note that there is a difference between two of the seemingly similar advanced descriptors, man-made and artificial. While everything that is man-made is artificial, not everything artificial is man-made. For example, a beaver dam is artificial, but it is not man-made. Note also that energetics refers to a feeling that the target is associated with some significant quantity of energy. This energy can be in any form: kinetic, radiant, explosive, anything. While movement can also indicate an expenditure of energy, the movement of a snail or a slowly driven car might not be perceived as energetics. Underneath Part A, where we describe the movement of the pen during the writing of the ideogram, as well as the primitive and the advanced descriptors, underneath that, we write a capital B followed by a colon. You then declare what you perceive the ideogram to represent. The most common declaration is no B, and you write capital N-O dash capital B, no B. While you must have one primitive descriptor and one advanced descriptor for each ideogram, you do not have to declare a substantive B. However, the viewer must at least write the words no B. Unlike the primitive and advanced descriptors, there is no fixed list of possible declarations for B. However, we do have a list that we use here at the Farsight Institute for the first few days of training so that people can get used to the possibilities that could occur with a B. The list that we use is no B, structure, water, dry land, wet land, motion, subject, mountain, city, sand, ice, and swamp. Note that these declarations are at a higher level of abstraction than when describing the movement of the pen when drawing the ideogram. The entire process in Phase 1 moves from lower to higher levels of abstraction as follows: describing the movement of the pen, primitive descriptors, advanced descriptors, and an interpretive declaration of the meaning of the gestalt. Yet you must remember that the declaration that is made in Part B is still very low level. For example, a viewer would not declare that the gestalt represents an automobile, a computer, a skyscraper, or a spaceship, since these declarations would be far too high level, involving conscious mind interpretations that greatly exceed the quality and the quantity of data that are available at this point in the session. For example, if the target really is a skyscraper, then the best that could be determined at this point is that the target is associated with a structure. We are now going to describe the next and final part of Phase 1 that is used in the basic scientific remote viewing procedures. You may continue now with the next lesson.